So, in an unexpected twist here, I have a second case that I'm going to go ahead and review here for you guys. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. I can't comment too much about it, other than it takes place mainly in Canada, and there are other known locations that this person allegedly traveled to, but I found it to be a fairly serious case. It's a case of a man by the name of Clifford Olson. And I've looked forward to this for a while, in truth, but ultimately I'd like to see that you guys can get this to a much wider audience, and that's the reason I'm doing this. I feel these cases are receiving some flack and that they don't have the deserved attention they really need to have. So I appreciate it that you can go ahead and pass this forward. Of course, the main case that's going on, the Schulte and Jelani Day case, is ongoing. And these cases I really felt quite strongly about, so I appreciate, your comments, and if you can pass them forward, please be sure to get them much wider attention. Thank you again. Clifford Olson Jr., or Robert Olson, in other words, was a Canadian serial killer known best as the Beast of British Columbia. Olson confessed to the RP murder of 11 underage children and young adults between the ages of 9 and 18 in the 1980s. Olson was considered a dangerous offender, and the sentencing judge recommended Clifford Olson never be released from prison. He had 3 parole applications, and each were rejected. Clifford Olson died of cancer on September 30th, 2011, while in prison. Serial killer Clifford Olson was known as the Beast of British Columbia and had been active for 2 years between 1980 and 1981, known to have at least 11 possible victims. So this was really terrifying, folks. If you can just kind of put this into words, these children, most of these underage girls and whatnot, they were assaulted with different things, and he killed all of his victims in much the same way. Some of the boys and other gender people that he killed, he would literally torture them, and he would slash them multiple times during the altercations they had. So he would essentially trap them in a certain area, and he would come in kind of by surprise from behind, and then he would, strangle them to death, and sometimes he would stab them multiple times with something sharp. And it wasn't always a knife. He used various instruments. He used a tool. It kind of came from a woodshed in the backhoe area of the British Columbia wilderness, and he was just a real piece of work. In 1980, Clifford Olson started his official killing spree. As a serial killer, he was known as the Strangler. He would strangle, RP, and murder all of his victims. At the time of his crimes, he was living with his wife and child. So if you can imagine this, folks, this man is unusual for the kind of serial killer archetype we normally see, because he was married. He was married and he had a family, and he was going around the woods and so on at night, picking up children and doing this horrific crime. It's hard to imagine until you really look and study the history of Olson and study this story, because when I looked into it, I was fairly shocked. I was shocked by this. He was arrested August 12th, 1981, and convicted on January 14th, 1982. Then he was sentenced to life in prison in Saint-Anne-des-Plaines, Quebec. Olson was convicted on charges of murder and other felonies. So he had weapons. He allegedly even had a firearm type of weapon at some point, although I haven't looked into that too deeply. But he would strangle his victims and he would literally cut them, sometimes cut them apart as far as slash at them many times. And it was terrible because the whole community in British Columbia was in fear of this man. And you can imagine why. Okay, you folks can imagine the reason why is because he had done this more than 11 times. This is really, really horrific. And we're going to learn just a little about what kind of led to these circumstances as well soon. Clifford Olson. He chose mostly victims between the ages of 9 and 18. You could never, ever replace what this guy has done. Thank you. Clifford Olson, Canada's most reviled serial killer who continued to torment his victims even after they were gone, is hours from death. They say Clifford Olson's last breath will bring closure to decades of unheard of, unspeakable crimes as he ended his murder spree in a controversial cash for bodies deal. Sharon Rosenfeld, the mother of one of his ill-fated victims, said the weight of Clifford Olson's actions has been hanging around her neck like a heavy necklace for 3 decades. I think it will lighten somewhat with his death. Actually, I think it'll lighten quite a bit with his passing, she said in an interview with the Canadian Free Press. Olson has been moved to a hospital in Quebec City, and officials have told the family of his victims that he isn't expected to live. The news is something Raymond King, age 69, has been waiting for ever since his 15-year-old son was abducted and murdered. And he murdered these kids viciously, folks. He just was a terrible, awful, awful person. He would abduct these kids and sneak up from behind them. And he would take out, his tool of choice. Sometimes it was a rope or something and strangle them right there. It's just horrific to ponder. And, some people have covered some of these cases. I know Grizzly True Crime covered one of them that is more near the Canada line. But on the whole, people don't know about what happened. And so I'm just urging you guys more and more as we continue here, get this out to the public, get people aware of what had happened here and some of these horrific crimes, because people need to learn more about what's going on. And today in society, unfortunately, we're seeing things like this. In certain parts of the world, we're seeing it quite often. So it goes on and continues. It will close some doors, at least. He will be out of our face. And it has been really difficult for us to heal with his interference in our lives all this time. But I'm ready to move on, King said in Maple Ridge, British Columbia. The media didn't help. They just faithfully reported everything he had to say for some reason. So they would just repeat whatever Clifford Olson would say, which has been quite distressing for everyone. Rosenfeld said she was told by the Commissioner for Corrections in Canada that the 71-year-old killer's cancer spread throughout his whole body. At first it was a shock, and then I became emotional, not necessarily over Olson himself, but over my son's horrible fate and all of this that has gone on for our family that's devastated us for years. Clifford Olson may have only days to live now, as Rosenfeld says, in a state of relief, but also confusion. I felt, my God, Sharon, I should be feeling wonderful, but I've been conditioned, I guess. I was raised in a Christian system that I just don't get glad over anyone's death. 16-year-old Darren Johnsrud, one of Olson's first victims, was Rosenfeld's own son. King said victim service staff had been phoning the families over the last few months every time Olson was close to passing. He was at Olson's last parole hearing in December and said Olson had mentioned that it might be his last hearing. King didn't believe much of what Olson said during his parole, but then he had an affidavit saying he renounced Canadian citizenship. Last year, the federal government moved to cut off Olson's more than $1,100 monthly stipend for his age-old security. The cutoff would take effect this January. Clifford Olson, once dubbed the Beast of British Columbia, has served a life sentence at a maximum security prison for over a decade. He was handed 2 concurrent life terms in 1982 after pleading guilty to the murders, which occurred in around the Vancouver area of 1981. The admission followed a deal that paid Mr. Olson $100,000 to lead police to the remains of his young victims. The case, especially blood money payoffs, sparked a storm of controversy. Because the trial was aborted, much of the evidence surrounding the murders in the police investigation was never disclosed. So there are other victims that they still have yet to get to because it has taken so much of their focus to deal just with the horrific crimes that were confirmed and unearthed. And it really is terrible when you think about it. Between 1980 and 1981, he had more than 11 victims. At least 7 of those, it appears, were, female. The others were male or other gender. But they all died in similar ways. And it's horrible to look at this. And you wonder, what else has gone on since that time. Olson faced 10 first-degree murder counts as his trial began, but it had barely begun when he reversed his not guilty plea. So for some reason, he reversed his own not guilty plea. And to this day, we still don't know exactly why. But the children, that he's responsible for getting rid of, these horrible crimes that they did and what he did to these children, we just need a lot more, we need a lot more attention to this. So thank you. Just a little more as we go into the Clifford Olson story. Appreciate it. By the time the Twin Otter taxied on the runway in Abbotsford, Olson's excursion had been leaked to the media. The RCMP was watching him very carefully because Olson is a master manipulator. So they were right there in the taxi. They were watching everything very, very carefully for this trip. The car chase ensued as everyone was following them, and they didn't want to lose the journalists. So apparently they were trying to cover some of this so that they could get into the courthouse and so on. British Columbia attorney Alan Williams panicked and ordered the Mounties to fly back to Ontario, to fly him back there. He did not care that the RCMP wanted to resolve the unsolved murders that same day. Olson was such a hot political topic they didn't want the heat at that time. The province of British Columbia was literally all abuzz for the Cash for Bodies scandal. When Olson died from cancer, Shanice was the first to be notified. He died with his secrets. That's what they were all concerned about, folks, is that he would die with his secrets because he did so many horrific things. And he lured some of these victims out using a similar taxi to this that he rode in the courthouse for his final trip to the courthouse. Olson acted like he had empathy for the slain 9-year-old and told investigators he wanted to help because we've got to keep the kooks off the street. In a span of 9 months, between 1980 and August 1981, Olson killed 11 times. The first victim, 12-year-old Christine Weller, was abducted near her Surrey home while riding her bicycle. In late November of 1980, her body was found on Christmas Day, strangled and stabbed. 3 others were picked up in Surrey: 13-year-old Colleen Daignault, 16-year-old Sandra Lynn Wolfsteiner, and 9-year-old Simon Paddington. Darren Johnsrud, age 16, Judy Cosma, 14, and Raymond King Jr., 15, all vanished from their new Westminster home, as well as Anita Court, age 13, and Sigrun Ahmed, 18, who were all picked up in Coquitlam. Louise Chatran, age 17, was picked up walking in Maple Ridge, and Terry Lynn Carson, age 15, was found strangled right outside of Chilliwack. So he had literally spared no time. He got to killing more than 10 victims within that short amount of time that he was out and wandering in the British Columbia streets among the public. And nobody was any the wiser, folks. You just can't imagine how horrific this was. They couldn't tell. I mean, some of the constables could tell there was something off with him, but on the whole, nobody could tell that he was a serial killer. They didn't know what was going on at all. With Olson, that was hard to keep things under wraps. There were times when he wanted to throttle Olson, moments when he thought, if these were my kids, I would lose it. The public, however, did not see Shantz as a lawyer doing his job. They questioned whether he was even real. By the time the $100,000 cash for bodies deal was public, Shantz was receiving death threats day and night. Though a judge initially ruled that the $100,000 plus interest and legal costs had to be returned immediately, the ruling was overturned on a series of appeals. Shantz had parted ways with the law firm. At the Canadian Legal Conference in Montreal in 2003, Shantz presented a paper on his experience. I began having difficulty relating normally to other people. So Olson made a deal, and his deal was essentially to keep this out of the public spotlight, and in exchange for $100,000, the Attorney General guaranteed 11 first-degree murder convictions and ended an investigation. So basically, he just wanted to be seen as guilty, but he wanted to keep it out of the media, which that didn't work out for you, Clifford Olson. And now everybody knows. Thank God. Thank God that they do. But he wanted to die in peace, and essentially he did in the hospital, with his cancer, but then all of the media thankfully found out about this, because everyone needs to know and be aware of this case. Abbotsford is an So this was the area in Abbotsford where he would take his little taxi, essentially. Right here, near the hotel, Clifford Olson would be found strangling his victims. He would kidnap them right here in this area, and this is near the exact same area where he disposed of some of the bodies and the exact area where he went to trial for the same set of 11 murders. 11 murders is what he ended up doing, folks. So please go ahead and make sure to spread the word. We want others to know for certain about this case, and they should also be made aware of the fact that some of the psychologists that were initially with the court enabled his behavior. So it wasn't only just Clifford Olson. There were some people in British Columbia that enabled him to do this, which is quite sad. And his lawyer didn't want to believe. He lived in a make-believe world. He didn't want to believe that he really killed all 11 victims. And of course he did. So thank you. Be sure to spread the word. I appreciate this.